Sinbad the Sailor, Episode 2, The Second Voyage, Chapter 1, A Restless Heart. The next day, Sinbad returned to Sinbad's house, just as he had promised. Sinbad welcomed him warmly and invited him to sit in the garden near the fountain. "Yesterday," Sinbad said, "I told you how I nearly drowned on my first voyage, and how I promised myself I would never go to sea again." "I remember," Sinbad said. "It was a wise promise." Sinbad smiled. "For almost a year I kept it. I enjoyed my house, my garden, and the company of my friends, but little by little I grew restless." He explained that the memory of danger had slowly faded, while the memory of wonder had grown stronger. He thought often of the strange islands, the distant cities, and the marvels he had seen in the service of King Mirage. "A merchant's heart is never fully at rest," Sinbad said. "Mine kept turning toward the sea." So he bought fine goods once again, cloth, spices, and other treasures of Baghdad, and traveled to Basra, where he joined a group of merchants preparing for a long voyage. The ship set sail on a clear morning, and Sinbad felt his old excitement return. Chapter 2, Left Behind Again. The voyage went well. The ship stopped at many ports, and Sinbad traded his goods for a fair profit at each one. One day, the captain guided the ship toward a small, uninhabited island. It was unlike any place Sinbad had seen. Clear streams ran between banks of soft grass, colorful flowers grew everywhere, and birds sang in the trees. The merchants went ashore to rest and enjoy the fresh air. Some ate fruit from the trees, others walked along the streams. Sinbad wandered farther than the rest, admiring the beauty of the island. He found a quiet spot beneath a tree, ate some fruit, and drank cool water from a stream. The warm air and the gentle sound of the water made him drowsy. Without meaning to, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. When he woke, the sun was already low in the sky. Sinbad hurried back toward the shore, but when he arrived, his heart sank. The ship was gone. In their hurry to leave, the sailors had counted the passengers wrong and had not noticed that Sinbad was missing. "Not again," he whispered, staring at the empty sea. "I am alone once more." Chapter 3. The Great White Dome. Sinbad forced himself to stay calm. He remembered how he had survived his first misfortune, and he decided to explore the island rather than give up in despair. He climbed a low hill to see more of the land. From the top, he noticed something strange in the distance. An enormous white shape, round and smooth, rising from the ground like a small hill of its own. Curious, Sinbad walked toward it. Up close, the object was astonishing. It was perfectly round, taller than a house, and completely smooth, without a single door, window, or crack. He walked all the way around it, searching for some way inside, but he found nothing. He pressed his hand against the surface. It felt hard and slightly warm, like something alive. Suddenly, the sky grew dark, as if a great cloud had passed in front of the sun. Sinbad looked up and felt a chill of fear. A bird was flying above him, a bird so enormous that its wings blocked out the light. He remembered stories that sailors had once told him, tales of a giant bird called a roc, powerful enough to carry an elephant in its claws. "This is no hill," Sinbad realized. "It is the roc's egg." Quickly, he hid himself behind a fold in the shell just as the great bird landed and settled itself over the egg to keep it warm through the night. Chapter 4. Tied to a giant's leg. Sinbad lay awake all night, hidden in the shadow of the enormous bird, thinking of a plan. He knew that a roc could fly across seas and deserts in a single day. If the bird carried him away from this empty island, he might reach a land where people lived. It was a dangerous plan, but Sinbad had no better one. At dawn, before the roc could rise, Sinbad unwound the long cloth of his turban. Carefully and quietly, he wrapped one end tightly around the bird's massive leg and tied the other end firmly around his own waist. Moments later, the roc stood, stretched its enormous wings, and rose into the sky. The ground fell away beneath Sinbad with terrifying speed. The wind roared in his ears, and the island shrank to a small green dot far below. He held on with all his strength, praying that the knots would hold. The rock flew for a long time, higher than the clouds, over a wide blue sea. At last, it began to descend toward a deep, rocky valley surrounded by mountains too steep to climb. As soon as the great bird touched the ground, Sinbad worked quickly to untie the cloth from its leg. His fingers trembled, but he freed himself just before the rock noticed him and walked away in search of food. Chapter 5. The Valley of Diamonds. Sinbad looked around and caught his breath. The floor of the valley sparkled like a sky full of stars. Diamonds, thousands of them of every size, lay scattered across the ground, glittering in the morning light. His joy did not last long. As he stepped forward, he saw movement among the rocks. Enormous snakes, longer than the tallest trees, slid across the valley floor. Sinbad had heard that such snakes could swallow an elephant whole. He looked up at the cliffs surrounding him. They rose high and smooth on every side, with no path leading out. I have escaped the sea, he thought, only to be trapped in a valley of monsters. As evening came, the snakes began to search for shelter, just as Sinbad did. He found a narrow cave in the rock, crawled inside, and blocked the entrance with a heavy stone, leaving only a small gap for air. Through the gap, he watched an enormous snake glide past in the darkness, its scales shining faintly in the moonlight. Sinbad sat frozen with fear until the creature moved on. In the morning, he noticed something strange. Large pieces of fresh meat were falling from the sky above the cliffs, landing with heavy thuds across the valley floor. Then Sinbad remembered a story he had once heard from an old sailor in Basra, a story about merchants who gathered diamonds in a valley guarded by snakes, using a clever and daring trick. Chapter 6. Escape on an Eagle's Wings. The merchants, unable to enter the valley themselves, threw large pieces of meat down from the cliffs above. The sticky meat landed among the diamonds, and diamonds pressed into its surface. Eagles, watching from their nests high on the cliffs, would swoop down, seize the meat in their claws, and carry it up to their nests. The merchants, hidden nearby, would then shout loudly and bang pieces of wood together to frighten the birds away, allowing them to collect the diamonds left behind. Sinbad understood at once that this was his chance. He gathered the finest diamonds he could find and filled every pocket, fold, and pouch of his clothing until he could carry no more. Then he took the largest piece of meat he could find, tied himself firmly to it with the remains of his turban, and lay still on his back, waiting. He did not have to wait long. A powerful eagle swept down, sank its claws into the meat, and lifted both the meat and Sinbad high into the air. The bird carried its heavy prize up to a nest at the top of the cliff. As the eagle began to tear at the meat, the merchants below shouted and beat their sticks against the rocks, just as always. Startled, the great bird released its prize and flew off. The merchant who owned that particular piece of meat climbed up to collect his diamonds, and stopped in astonishment. Lying beside the meat, alive and covered in dust, was a man. "Who are you?" the merchant demanded, "and how did you come to be here?" Chapter 7. Wonders on the Way Home. At first, the merchant feared that Sinbad had stolen diamonds meant for him, and he spoke angrily. But when Sinbad calmly explained his journey, the rock, the egg, the terrible valley, and his desperate plan, the merchant's anger turned to wonder. The other merchants gathered around, amazed that anyone had survived such dangers and lived to tell of them. "In all my years of gathering diamonds this way," the head merchant said, "no man has ever returned from that valley alive." To thank the merchant whose meat had carried him to safety, Sinbad offered him a generous share of his diamonds. The merchant accepted gladly, and the two parted as friends rather than rivals. Sinbad traveled onward with the merchants, trading at ports along the way, and hearing of wonders greater than any he had seen before. On one island, he saw forests of camphor trees so massive that 100 men could rest in the shade of a single trunk. On another, he heard of a great rhinoceros strong enough to carry a full-grown elephant balanced on its horn, wandering blindly until the sun melted the elephant's fat and both animals fell together. Truly, Sinbad said to his companions, the world holds more marvels than any one man could see in 100 lifetimes. At last, after selling his diamonds for a great fortune at various ports, the ship reached Basra, and from there Sinbad traveled the familiar road home to Baghdad. Chapter 8. Home again. Sinbad returned to his house, wealthier than he had ever been. He gave generously to the poor, helped his relatives, and built a life of comfort once again, richer this time not only in gold, but in stories. For many months, Sinbad told Hindbad, I lived quietly and gave thanks for my escape. I told myself that 2 narrow escapes from death were surely enough for one man. Hindbad nodded eagerly. Surely they were. Sinbad laughed softly. That is what I believe too. But the sea calls to those who have once answered it. Before long, I found myself standing on the docks of Basra again, looking at the ships and wondering what lay beyond the horizon. He looked toward the fountain, where the water sparkled like the diamonds he had once carried out of that terrible valley. What I found on my 3rd voyage, Sinbad said, was stranger and more dangerous than anything I have told you yet. But that story must wait for another day. Once again, Sinbad placed a purse of 100 gold pieces into Hindbad's hands. Hindbad thanked him deeply and left the house, already wondering what dangers awaited in the tale of the 3rd voyage. Theme. Curiosity and the desire for adventure can lead people back into danger, even after they have promised themselves safety. The story also shows that quick thinking and courage can turn even the most desperate situation into an opportunity. Discussion question. Do you think Sinbad was wise or foolish to tie himself to the rock's leg? What else could he have done?